Module 5, Politics, Civil Rights, and Protesting. Civil Rights. Civil rights are individual rights that are enforceable by law. The right to be free of arbitrary and discriminatory treatment by government is a civil right. In the aftermath of the American Civil War, the U.S. Constitution was amended to prohibit any state from limiting the privileges and immunities of citizens, depriving any person of life, liberty, or property without due process, and denying any person the equal protection of the law, the 14th Amendment. The new amendments also abolished slavery. The purpose of these constitutional reforms was to extend civil rights protections to Black Americans, former slaves, as well as free blacks denied the basic rights enjoyed by white citizens. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 specifically defined the rights that could not be denied to any citizen. The act guaranteed that all citizens, irrespective of race or color, would have the equal right to make and enforce contracts, to sue, be parties, and give evidence, to inherit, purchase, lease, sell, hold, and convey real and personal property, and to full and equal benefit of all laws and proceedings for the security of person and property, and be subject to like punishment, pains, and penalties. The constitutional amendments and the 1866 Act were passed by a Congress that favored extending full civil rights to African Americans as the war ended. During this period, many of the Southern states that had seceded had not yet been readmitted into the Union and had no representatives in Congress. However, after the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln in April 1865, Lincoln's vice president, Andrew Johnson, pushed for laws that would speedily readmit the Southern states without regard for the civil rights of African Americans. Johnson vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which only became law after Congress overrode Johnson's veto. Despite the constitutional and legislative reforms, Southern states severely limited the rights of blacks, using state and local laws to deny black citizens their rights and to enforce racial segregation. These restrictions were enabled by a Supreme Court decision that limited the scope of protections guaranteed by the 14th Amendment, giving states leeway to deny civil rights on the basis of race as they had prior to the war. These post-Civil War restrictions on the rights of African Americans were known as Black Codes. The goal of these discriminatory laws was to return the former slaves to an inferior economic and social status. The Black Codes usually included laws restricting black people's property rights, their freedoms to conduct business on equal terms as white people, and the right to vote and to serve on juries. The states also passed vagrancy laws designed to recreate many of the same conditions that blacks faced under slavery. For example, in some states, unemployed blacks were legally defined as vagrants and could be charged a fine. If they could not pay and the fine was paid by another party, that party could compel the unemployed black resident to work for him to pay off the debt. Southern states and localities also enforced segregation of the races in public spaces through a series of regulations called the Jim Crow laws. This policy of systemic separation of the races was also enabled by a Supreme Court decision, Plessy v. Ferguson, which held that separate accommodations for different racial groups did not violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment if the accommodations afforded each group were equal. Under this separate but equal doctrine, Southern states segregated the white and black populations in the educational, employment, and healthcare spheres. Whites and blacks were required by law to attend different schools, sit in different compartments on public transportation, eat at different restaurants, and use separate restrooms. These conditions remained largely unchanged through the middle of the 20th century, when each of the branches of the federal government took steps to end the system of racial segregation and systematic denial of civil rights. In 1954, a major step forward in the efforts to end segregation was achieved when the Supreme Court overturned the earlier Plessy ruling. In Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, the court unanimously held that the doctrine of separate but equal was unconstitutional, and that the Constitution forbids segregation by race in public education. In a later ruling, the Supreme Court ordered state governments to act with all deliberate speed to end segregation in public schools. Southern leaders condemned the ruling as a political decision rather than a judicial one and called for mass resistance to its implementation. State officials refused to take steps to integrate the schools. Local communities closed the public schools, setting up private academies with public funding to resist desegregation. Black families who tried to enroll children into integrated schools faced threats of violence and economic consequences if they went forward with the enrollment. Eventually, the executive branch took action to ensure that integration became a reality. In 1957, the governor of Arkansas ordered the state National Guard to prevent 9 black students from attending an all-white high school. Despite a court order requiring integration, the students were turned away, while being screamed at and spit on by the crowd gathered at the school. To enforce the court order and to end the standoff, President Dwight Eisenhower ordered U.S. Army troops to Little Rock to ensure that black students could attend the school unmolested by local police or protesters trying to prevent desegregation. In the following decade, President Lyndon Johnson, together with Congress, the legislative branch, enacted historic legislation to enshrine the end of discrimination against black citizens into law. Johnson led the efforts to pass the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited discrimination or segregation with respect to public accommodations, including hotels, restaurants, theaters, and sporting events, on the basis of race, color, religion, or national origin. This law effectively ended any legal basis for the Jim Crow laws enforcing segregation in the southern states. The act also desegregated governmental facilities and public education. 1 year later, again with Johnson's forceful leadership, Congress passed a Voting Rights Act, outlawing racial discrimination in voting. Under the act, states and local governments were prohibited from imposing voting rules that resulted in the denial of the right to vote on a basis of race. The act also specifically banned the use of literacy tests, which required citizens to demonstrate that they could read and write and were historically used to disenfranchise African Americans from their right to vote. The new law also established a pre-clearance requirement under which any change to voting laws in certain covered jurisdictions, those which had employed discriminatory practices to discourage voting, needed to obtain federal approval before they could be enacted. Congress also passed the Fair Housing Act as part of a new civil rights bill in 1968, which protected individuals from discrimination in connection with the sale and rental of housing. These historic civil rights laws, along with enforcement rulings by the judicial branch, ended legal discrimination in the U.S. a century after the end of the Civil War. While circumstances have changed significantly and the denial of rights and segregation is no longer legal, the debate over race and discrimination continues today. In August 2014, Michael Brown, an 18-year-old African American, was shot and killed by a police officer in Ferguson, Missouri. 6 years later, in Minneapolis, a 46-year-old African American, George Floyd, died after a police officer knelt on his neck for an extended period of time. While the circumstances differed, each of these killings and the protests that followed them sparked a national conversation about race in America and the legacy of discrimination. Freedom of religion. Another contested area of politics is the scope of the freedom of religion. The Constitution guarantees the right of the free exercise of religion. However, the Constitution also prohibits the government from making any law concerning the establishment of religion. This latter provision, known as the Establishment Clause, has been interpreted broadly to mean that government may not act in a way that favors one religion over another, or favors religion over non-religion. Much of the controversy concerning the freedom of religion comes when the Free Exercise Clause and the Establishment Clause come into conflict. In 1963, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Abington School District v. Schempp that a Pennsylvania law requiring public school students to read Bible verses and recite the Lord's Prayer was unconstitutional. The justices held that biblical readings have an inherently religious character, and requiring students in government-run school to engage in this activity violates the neutrality in matters of religion required under the Establishment Clause. A more recent case, Westside Community Board of Education v. Mergens, arose when a school denied students the right to form a Christian Bible study group as an after-school club. The school district argued that school policy required all clubs to have a faculty sponsor, and that such a sponsorship by school officials would violate the Establishment Clause. Federal law also restricts public school employees from participating in religious activity at the school in their official capacity. However, the court held that since the school provided after-school opportunities for students to engage in areas of interest, the school could not deny the same opportunity to students who wished to meet for religious purposes. The court also held that in the context of after-school activities, offering religious groups the same treatment as non-religious groups did not violate the Establishment Clause. Women's suffrage. The Seneca Falls Convention, held over 2 days in July 1848 in the Wesleyan Chapel in Seneca Falls, New York, is traditionally considered the birthplace of the women's suffrage movement. Hundreds of women and some men attended the convention, which advertised itself as a convention to discuss social, civil, and religious condition and the rights of women. The attendees discussed the progress of the reforms movement to increase the rights of women and debated whether to adopt the right for women to vote as part of the platform. Over 100 attendees signed the Declaration of Sentiments modeled on the U.S. Declaration of Independence, which declared that all men and women were endowed with inalienable rights, listed the injuries and usurpations on the part of man towards woman, and called for social and political reforms for women. While practical reforms were not immediate, the meeting at Seneca Falls sparked many other conventions dedicated to advancing the right of women, leading more women and men to join the cause of women's rights and eventually to the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, giving women the right to vote. Protest. While the government played an important role in advocating the rights of marginalized groups, there is a proud legacy of popular protest by people publicly standing in opposition to injustice. This protest tradition includes the practice of civil disobedience, the refusal to obey unjust laws or the demands of government in order to call attention to the wrongs and to influence policy. Nonviolent civil disobedience in the form of boycotts, picketing, and the refusal to pay taxes has made a particularly important impact on American society. Famously, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white passenger and moved to the back of the bus when instructed to do so by the bus driver. Parks' act of civil disobedience and subsequent arrest for violation of Alabama's segregation laws sparked a year-long boycott of the Montgomery bus system. In Greensboro, North Carolina, in a planned act of civil disobedience, African-American students sat in the whites-only section of a Woolworth's lunch counter and asked to be served. They returned day after day despite being refused service, joined by hundreds of demonstrators to continue the lunch counter sit-in to publicize the injustice of racial segregation, fully expecting to be arrested. After several days and dozens of arrests, the store owners agreed to change the store policy of segregation. The actions of Parks and the student sit-in became symbols for nonviolent civil disobedience that marked the civil rights movement. More recently, environmental protests have drawn attention to the threat to our national resources. In 2016, youth from the Standing Rock Sioux tribe in North Dakota gathered at the construction site for a pipeline being built to transport oil from North Dakotas to Illinois. They protested the construction of the pipeline, which would run within 1,500 feet of the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation, because they feared that an oil spill could threaten the water supply, as well as the tribe's sacred sites. Tribal leaders claimed that the federal government had failed to consult tribal governments and rushed through the pipeline approval process without the proper study of the impacts. This grassroots movement would grow into the Standing Rock Resistance Encampment, which drew national and even international attention. The local, state, and national government acted on behalf of the pipeline's owners to effectively undermine the protests in order to allow the pipeline to be completed. Police even used pepper spray, tear gas, and rubber bullets to clear the protesters, and the National Guard was called in. Although the protests were eventually cleared, Standing Rock became a symbol for the fight for environmental rights and the rights of indigenous peoples. Contemporary political issues. In a nation with diverse people from diverse backgrounds, debate and conflict over issues capturing public attention is inevitable. Consider the ongoing debate over the problem of sexual violence on college campuses and the potential role of concealed weapons as a part of the solution. Both sides of the debate agree that the American higher education system has failed to properly address the threat of sexual violence on campus. Both sides blame college administrators for failing to prevent, report, and handle widespread incidents of sexual violence. However, the two sides differ on whether the concealed carry of guns on campus would help the fight against sexual violence or only make things worse. In response to the problem, some states are considering legislation that would require colleges to permit students to carry concealed firearms on campus. Proponents argue that college students should be permitted to legally carry firearms for protection. Pro-concealed carry women's groups have argued that it is important for women to have access to firearms, specifically on college campuses. Amanda Collins, a survivor of sexual assault on a campus that did not permit her to carry a gun on campus despite having a gun permit, became an advocate for concealed carry on campus, believing the policy would allow women to feel more secure and have the ability to defend themselves against sexual predation. Opponents of concealed carry on campus viewed guns as a highly problematic solution to the problem of campus violence. They are skeptical that, under real-world conditions, more guns will lead to less assaults. They argue that it is unrealistic to assume that someone who is being attacked or witnessing an attack will be in a position to quickly react to the situation and access a firearm in a way that would effectively deter the attack. They also note that the high likelihood of accidental shootings in a campus environment. Some also oppose the measure out of concern that the presence of guns on campus would make students feel less safe and would stifle the expression of opinion by students afraid of who might be carrying a concealed weapon. Corporate welfare, bank bailouts, and earmarks. Another area of divisive politics centers on the creation of government subsidies or tax breaks intended to help specific businesses or specific industries. The rationale behind these policies is that although the U.S. is a free market system, the government should step in to assist specific sectors that are important for the overall state of the economy or when it is in the public interest. For example, the federal government provides subsidies to farmers and agribusiness companies to promote specific farming practices and to keep the price of food stable. Another example are provisions in the federal tax code to grant tax breaks to businesses who incentivize keeping workers on the company's payroll. Critics of this practice, such as Senator Bernie Sanders, mockingly refer to it as corporate welfare. They argue that, in practice, such government programs favor large corporate interests who lobby the government for tax breaks and other benefits granted by government to pad their bottom line. The issue of government support for certain industries is particularly acute when it comes to the banking industry. One of the causes of the 2008 financial crisis was the practice of banks selling securities to investors that were backed by housing mortgages. These mortgage-backed securities were very profitable, and the banks sought to meet the growing demand for them by taking bigger risks, bundling increasingly riskier loans into mortgage-backed securities to sell to investors. Since many of the mortgages were given to people who could not afford them, the securities, whose value depended on the mortgages, were risky. However, because of the disconnect between the investors who effectively held the loans on the houses and the borrowers who took out the mortgages, investors could not properly value the risk of the mortgage-backed securities. So when the housing bubble burst, the foreclosures spread, and the value of the securities dropped precipitously. The effects of the housing market crash and the risky bank loans had drastic effects. Lehman Brothers, the fourth largest investment firm in the U.S., which had been heavily involved in mortgage-backed securities, filed for bankruptcy. Fearful that the domino effect would lead to the failure of other large investment banks and a more widespread financial collapse, the government purchased the toxic assets held by the banks to stabilize the banking system. Although this $700 billion bailout of the banks succeeded in stabilizing the economy, it was an unpopular decision, appearing to many that the bailout was rewarding the very bankers who had acted recklessly for their own profit and threatened the financial health of the U.S. economy in the process. Another contentious practice is when Congress dedicates money to a specific project known as a legislative earmark. An earmark, also called congressionally directed spending, is a provision inserted into a discretionary appropriations bill directing funds to a specific recipient or a specific project without a competitive or merit-based process. Earmarks can include, for example, funds for a particular transportation project or a cultural organization. Earmarks have been derided as pork barrel spending, meaning inessential funding for projects favored by politicians to win them popularity in the district receiving the earmarked funds. However, constituents do benefit from many earmarks for popular services or much-needed infrastructure improvements. Politicians who secure earmarks for their voters can claim credit for such projects, boosting fundraising prospects and their chances of re-election. Important recent political events. Several unprecedented political events of the past 2 decades have changed the U.S. political landscape. On September 11, 2001, the deadliest terrorist attack on American soil introduced a new era of concern over public safety and fear of terrorism, while also creating tension with the commitment to civil liberties and the right to privacy. The Islamist terrorist group Al-Qaeda hijacked 4 planes with the aim of crashing them into landmarks of the U.S. political, military, and economic system. Indelible images on television of planes crashing into the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon shocked Americans and changed not only the political landscape, but Americans' daily routines. Increased security, including invasive personal searches by federal officers at the airport, became a part of everyday life. The Department of Homeland Security was established to protect against further acts of terrorism on American soil. The Patriot Act expanded the power of law enforcement to fight terror, including the ability to obtain private information and personal records and conduct surveillance against U.S. citizens. While these moves were seen as critical to protecting Americans, the growing security state concerned civil libertarians, who worried about government overreach and intrusion into the private lives of Americans. This debate over security versus civil liberties is one of the legacies of the September 11th attacks, which continues to this day. In 2010, President Barack Obama pressed the Congress to fulfill one of his campaign promises and enact universal health care coverage for all Americans. The result was the Affordable Care Act, which created a market-based health insurance exchange intended to expand health insurance coverage to millions of previously uninsured Americans through government subsidies. The law also set minimum standards for health insurance policies and prohibited insurance companies from denying coverage to individuals with pre-existing conditions. To keep the price of insurance premiums down, the law also mandated that every person in the United States have health insurance so that premiums paid by healthy people help to cover the health care costs for those more at risk. Republicans objected to what they saw as an intrusion by the government into the healthcare marketplace and mockingly referred to the new law as Obamacare. Most controversial was the individual mandate to purchase health insurance. The provision was upheld in a 5-4 Supreme Court decision, which conservative legal scholars criticized for bending over backwards to accommodate a law that, in an unprecedented manner, required Americans to buy a specific product. On the other side of the aisle, because political pressures compelled the Democrats to enact market-based health care rather than a government-run health insurance, liberals attacked the new law for not going far enough. Although the individual mandate has since been repealed, the Affordable Care Act remains the law of the land. Despite Republican promises of a full repeal and replacement of the legislation, and voices from some Democrats calling for a universal national health insurance program, no proposal has been able to muster majority support in the Congress, and the issue of health care remains a contentious issue in our politics. Finally, in the presidential election of 2016, the American people elected Donald Trump, a real estate mogul and TV star, as a first-time politician. Trump defeated Hillary Clinton, former First Lady, Senator, and Secretary of State. Trump successfully painted Clinton as out of touch with most Americans and rode a wave of populism to the White House. Trump's anti-immigration rhetoric was controversial and denounced as racist by Democrats, but Trump's campaign message of "Make America Great Again" brought out many previously apathetic Americans to vote. At the same time, there was a shift among the more highly educated Americans towards Clinton. The results of the election were surprising, but also contentious. Controversially, the FBI announced the reopening of an investigation into Clinton 11 days before the election. The results also brought the American electoral system into sharp scrutiny because Clinton lost the election despite winning 3 million more votes than Trump. However, Trump narrowly edged Clinton out in key swing states, giving him the victory in the Electoral College. The 2016 election, with its sharp division between partisans on each side who saw the other side as a threat to the country, and the backlash against the Republicans' hardline rhetoric, as well as against the perceived condescending elitism of the Democrats, shapes the political landscape we know today.